Hey, welcome back to E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Aaron, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm calling in from the offices of Gooder in LA. So I got a cool background here. But yeah, I'm doing great. I'm in the middle of a long travel stint.
There you go. I love it. And you were just at Beanstalk as well, right?
Yeah, that was a fantastic conference. Two of my friends were some of the organizers, Ben and Jesse. Just a fantastic conference. If you weren't able to go this year, I highly recommend going next year.
That's awesome. I love to hear it. Well, this season on E-commerce on Tap, we're covering skincare. Today, we're covering the brand Vacation, which I'd actually seen in Target before. I think it's one of the top sellers of sunscreen in Target. So pretty cool to be diving into their story. But for those that are tuning in for the first time, do you want to give a quick overview of what E-commerce on Tap is?
Absolutely. So basically, what we do is we take a well-known company, usually they have a D2C element. We tell their founding story, reverse engineer their supply chain, and then talk about their exit potential.
And we have a lot of fun doing it. And, I think this season of skincare has been pretty, interesting for Aaron and I as we don't, use these skincare products firsthand, but we really enjoy the stories and just I've been amazed by the growth of some of these brands. I mean, it's really been inspiring to see and just I didn't realize how big this category was.
Yeah, I have definitely improved my skincare routine. I've learned a lot more, and so I'm using stuff that I wasn't using maybe 6 months ago.
I can tell you're glowing today. Well, before we dive into the vacation story, was there anything that caught your eye this past week in terms of, newsworthy stories?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing was a conversation I had with Ryan Peterson of Flexport, and he has been talking a lot about the non-resident importer of record loophole that exists. And basically, there are no requirements for foreign entities to have any legal presence in the U.S. to import things into the country and to sell them on Amazon or whatever. And as a result, there's a very sizable minority of bad actors out there who will come in, cheat with customs. Customs will find them, they'll shut down, and then just kind of create a whole new entity or Amazon listing or things like that. And so we talked about how there is a lobbying effort going on in Congress, and there is a bill in draft status that will basically close this loophole. And we look at closing de minimis as something that was very, very difficult for a lot of brands out there. I actually think this may be a really good thing because what this bill is going to do is it's going to require that any foreign company has a US LLC and a US employee. And so there'll be lots of companies that pop up where, maybe I work for 500 companies, thinking like, a big office with a bunch of headquarters. But that little bit of friction is going to dissuade people from cheating in customs and tariffs and things like that. And so I think that'll actually help level the playing field quite a bit. The other thing that he mentioned was that the Justice Department has named their top two areas of focus from an enforcement point of view being number one, healthcare fraud, and number two, customs fraud. And so they have already this year 20x the headcount that they have working on this. And so I think it's really interesting as the tariffs definitely appear to be here to stay, how the government is posturing to protect U.S. companies and entities, as well as making sure they're going after people who are not doing the things that they should be doing.
Wow, it's pretty interesting. We'll see how that plays out. And yeah, I think this one hopefully should benefit e-commerce founders and operators rather than making them scramble with all the tariffs and everything going on. I saw, for me, I've been keeping tabs on just creator commerce and just his conversions that excites me. And, I've been following Bloom Nutrition and Nutrabolt expanded their stake in it. So they put in another $160 million, acquiring a majority of the brand. And I think it's a lot bigger than most people think. I mean, Bloom Nutrition last year, they reported they did about 200 million in revenue. And this year they're on track for about like 3 to 350, which I mean, when it comes to an influencer driven brand, I mean, that's almost as big as they get really. So pretty just incredible outcome. And I think a lot of people just didn't realize the size of some of these, creator driven brands like Bloom.
Yeah. Does Nutrabolt own the whole thing yet, or is there still some
They
equity
own
in
the
the?
vast majority, so this was their second time investing. So the total investment now is about 210 million.
Wow,
But yeah, originally it was a minority stake, and now they went and acquired the majority. So just incredible growth, and I mean, I'm sure the brand's going to continue to grow.
that's fantastic. Well, before we dive into vacation, I think it's helpful for us to zoom out a little bit. Like you said, we're wrapping up an entire season on skincare. We talked about Glow Recipe and Rhode and Medicaid and topicals and Curology. And I think one of the big takeaways that I had was that skincare really isn't a one size fits all type of business. It's really very fragmented. You've got groups of value driven brands, you've got celebrity driven brands, you've got science first brands, and so there's a lot of just interesting nuance, and I think it gets more and more fractured as time goes on, which means there's a lot of opportunity for would-be founders in the space.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy how big skincare is, right? It's $180 billion industry, and I mean, in vacations case, I think there's this key difference of skincare is usually aspirational or transformational. It promises kind of this improvement lens, but sunscreen is really kind of different, right? Because it's seen as preventative, right? To prevent yourself from getting sunburnt, and it's a typically essentially a harder sell because you're buying into something to stop damage that you can't necessarily see at the time, and it doesn't necessarily give you that instant result. But I mean, sunscreen definitely matters. I mean, this stat really stood out to me that 1 in 5 Americans will develop skin cancer by age 70, and daily SPF reduces the risk of melanoma by 40 to 50%. So I mean,
Wow.
I don't apply enough sunscreen, and reading this, I'm like, wow, I really probably should apply sunscreen more.
Yeah, I started to use lotion in the morning. It has a little bit of SPF in it, but you're right. It's amazing. I think as we before we dive into the vacation story itself, I think it would be helpful for us to talk a little bit about what sunscreen actually is and some of the science behind it. So I want to kind of go through sunscreen 101. Growing up, I knew that the sun gave off UV rays and that UV rays were bad, right? That's kind of what people were taught. But there are basically three types of UV rays out there. You've got UVA, think of A for aging, and these are the long wavelength UV rays. And this is what causes wrinkles, aging, and some cancers. You've got UVB, which is what gives you the burns. These are medium size UV rays. And this is where you can get surface burns, DNA damage. It's the main cause of sunburns and cancers. Then you've got UVC. This is the shortwave, extremely dangerous. This is like gamma radiation things that will really, really mess you up if it is there. Luckily, the ozone is a good job at attracting these UVC rays, and so most of those don't come down. But when a couple of decades ago, they were talking about the hole in the ozone. This is why that was so important, was because these UVC rays were coming in. So most sunscreens, they try to protect you from the UVA and the UVB rays because the environment does the UVCs. And typically with sunscreens, you've got two types, two camps. You've got a chemical filter, which really absorbs the UV and helps turn it into heat. So that's why sometimes if you've got a chemical sunscreen on, your skin will feel hot. And it's not just because of the sun; it's because the sunscreen is absorbing that stuff and then making it much warmer. It can be a little bit irritating for some people, can cause some harm, but it's invisible and smooth, and so it's very popular. Uh, the kind of newer piece, it's not new, but it's becoming more popular, is mineral based sunscreen. This is where you have like zinc oxide, titanium dioxide, things like that. And what this does is rather than absorbing the UV rays, it reflects them, it scatters them away. And so these are historically kind of chalky and thick and were very popular until recently with the technology improving. But they are gentler on the environment. They're better for coral reefs and things like that. And so, historically, most sunscreen has been this chemical filter type, and that was very popular in the 60s and 70s. And there's been a lot of ingredients that have been phased out over time. And if you think about the zinc oxide paste, which is a mineral base, that's where the lifeguards, you probably see the old pictures in like Sandlot or something, the lifeguards have the white chalky thing. That's zinc
Yeah.
oxide. That's kind of what's there. But starting in the 80s and up to the 2000s, there was this explosion of new development in the chemical space. You had a lot of brands becoming more lightweight, more invisible sunscreen. The SPF ratings rocketed from SPF 15 to all the way up to 30, 50, and even 100. And typically, these mineral sunscreens stayed very niche. They were more for kids. They were more for sensitive skin. But fast forward to the 2010s, and there's been a big push from a regulatory perspective to move toward mineral-based sunscreens. There's Hawaii passed a law in 2018, which was effective in 2021, which basically banned a lot of the core chemicals in chemical sunscreens due to coral reef bleaching. And so places in Thailand and other tropical places pass this along as well. So it's actually illegal to buy that sunscreen or to bring that sunscreen to those places. And so now with the rise of clean beauty and things like that, it feels like things are being pushed more toward the mineral space.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of remember that shift, right? I remember as a kid, you used to just kind of spray sunscreen on all over the place, right? Whether it be SPS 50 or 100. And, generally the chemical driven filters are the higher SPFs, right? And they're great for water resistance. So I remember as a kid just, spraying myself down with this chemical based sunscreen. And now I've definitely seen this rise of mineral based sunscreen that I think is really kind of better for the environment, better for you, especially better for, kids and babies. And it's reef safe as well, which I think is really important. And so, the downsides, of course, like you discussed, is a bit thicker. It's kind of a bit, harder to put on in some sense, but in general, it is a lot better. And, Vacation itself is actually both, right? So Vacation has their mineral lotion that, is mineral sunscreen that use zinc oxide as its active ingredients, but they also offer their Vacation Classic sunscreen, which is a chemical sunscreen formulated that is Hawaiian Reef compliant, which I think has kind of become a bit of a standard when it comes to chemical sunscreen. So, I mean, it's just kind of interesting how this industry has evolved from very chemical kind of oriented to now, going back to something that I think is, better for everyone in general.
Yeah, we should clarify. I mean, the chemical sunscreens are still the most popular out there. That's what most people probably have in their beach bag. And it's not that chemical sunscreens are bad. It's just there are certain chemicals that have been recognized to cause damage to coral reefs. And so that's what's being phased out. So I think it's there. One of the
Yeah.
things I think is very interesting about the sun market in particular is the differences in sun. Do you kind of want to walk through what we found in the research in terms of how sunscreen is portrayed, regulated, looked at in different continents?
Yeah, I mean, so Australia, I've never been there, but definitely on my bucket list. It has very, very high UV radiation levels, and some of the highest skin cancer rates worldwide. So around 2,000 Aussies die annually. 2 out of 3 Australians are diagnosed with skin cancer in a lifetime, which is just crazy high. And so, sunscreens with SPF over 4 are regulated as therapeutic goods by the TGA there, and so it really has the most rigorous standards. And I think that, it's kind of reflected just in terms of their high UV. Europe and Brazil has kind of broad ingredient access, but cosmetic regulation. So sunscreens are regulated as cosmetics that make it easier for new UV filters to be approved. There's currently 34 filters allowed in the EU versus only 16 in the US, which is kind of interesting because, usually the EU is a bit tighter when it comes to their regulation around food and drugs. But despite the looser regulations, their studies show that EU sunscreens allow a third the UVA penetration compared to US products at similar SPF levels, reflecting around their stricter testing and ingredient availability. And here in America, we obviously have a slow FDA process with limited approved ingredients. So the FDA classifies sunscreens as over-the-counter drugs, not cosmetics. And so the approval process is much slower, limiting ingredients to only those really that are extensively researched, like zinc oxide, titanium dioxide are the only GRAZE approved filters as of 2021. And what's crazy to me is that the FDA hasn't approved any filters since 1996, despite a lot of them being used internationally. So, I think there's a question there that comes to mind for sure. But, it's just really interesting how different parts of the world are treating sunscreen in different ways. But generally speaking, it sounds like you almost need a different formulation for each of these regions, which would make it, number one, extremely hard for a player to expand internationally, but inherently it could be better to start somewhere specifically and expand elsewhere just based on the regulatory environment.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, we kind of went through this what if scenario. It's like, if I was going to start a sunscreen brand, where would I want to start of those three? And, you're looking at Australia, they have the highest regulatory bar because these are very serious implications. And so their government cares quite a bit about it. So, from the one perspective, is if you can pass the regulatory hurdles in Australia, you build credit globally because it's like a stamp of approval. And so it's very easy that way. You also, kind of get this point where these consumers in Australia are very used to using sunscreen. It's part of just daily life, given how high the consumer awareness is. And, being Australia certified can be a bit of a halo effect. And so there are some brands that have that and say, hey, we've got the harshest sun, so we can protect ourselves, and, why don't we protect you? The US on the other side has the lowest common denominator in terms of ingredient availability. Again, only those 16 approved filters, which are considered safe. And if you launch in the US, it's highly likely that you're going to need a new formulation to expand elsewhere. But the US is a huge market, and so you can build a huge business just by doing that. And so, I think too, from a consumer perspective, given the relatively lax regulation or the lax ingredient filters, US formulations could be seen as being somewhat inferior compared to EU or Australian products. And then you look at Europe on the other side, they have the broadest palette of ingredients. So it's really easy to create something that is innovative and elegant and high performing. And so it's much more like a cosmetic. And so if you are able to get through from a cosmetic perspective, you've got a really strong passport into Latin America and Africa. And so I think that, realistically, to sum it up, you can build a successful brand from any of these markets as a home base. I mean, there's some great Australia first brands like Ultraviolet out there that are exporting, that really leaning on this golden standard piece that they're doing. And then, US first, it's very much brand strategy and scale. Like, we'll talk about vacation, and EU is very much about innovation and elegance. And so there's a sunscreen brand, I think, out of Italy called Darling, which has very advanced formulations and, will then move down market into some more US compliant versions. And so I don't know, I just find this whole sector very interesting to me.
Yeah, and I mean it's pretty crazy, how big the market is. I think pretty much everyone in America at some point during the summer has used sunscreen, and the global sunscreen market um, last year was about 12.6 billion. It's expected to grow to about 19.9 billion by 2023, so about 5% growth rate. And the United States sunscreen market is about $2 billion, and mineral sunscreen is actually a minority of those sales, but is the fastest growing category at about 834 million. And so growing at about 11.8%. So I mean, mineral sunscreen, I think, is really having a breakout moment as I looked into this category. And I think there's a few reasons for this accelerated growth rate lately. I think number one, it's kind of shifting from this, seasonal only wear during the summer to more of a daily skincare routine and ritual. Like a lot of these different skincare brands are now including, SPF products as part of their lines, as well as, legacy brands that are kind of more, boring, functional, and just a bit outdated are now, kind of being reframed. And actually, there's a lot of competition now with those legacy brands. And so I think there's this kind of setup of a big market that's growing quite a bit, that is ripe for disruption, because incumbents never really made sunscreen desirable. And I think that's really where vacation has come in, right? Because their founding story really actually dates back to 2017, where the two co-founders met on a beach in Playa del Carmen in Mexico, right?
Yeah, I think this is a great story. It kind of reminds me of a couple of the other episodes that we've done, specifically Pura Vida, where they're just kind of out at the beach and hanging out. Do you want to walk us through that overall story?
Yeah, totally. So Lock Hall and Dakota Green, they were on the beach in 2017 in Mexico, and I guess kind of we're looking at different categories, and we're wondering like, why is sunscreen so boring and clinical? And Dakota and Locke had known each other since 2013. They were both working in the advertising world in New York City, and Locke, Australian born, began his career in the music industry doing viral marketing for bands on a tight budget. And they spent their days on the beach during this vacation, just kind of, I think, thinking about this market and kind of trace this shift from sunscreen being fun in a tearing era to clinical, around fear-based messaging, and wondered, could sunscreen be fun again? And I think Locke credits a lot of the insight to growing up in Australia, where the skincare cancer rate is extremely high, and there's just this kind of iconic slip, slop, slap sunscreen awareness campaign that was a, I guess, foundational influence on his desire to make sunscreen both fun and safe. So, I mean, definitely has some mirrors to the Pure Vita story of Paul and Griffin on the beach in Costa Rica, stumbling across bracelets. But I mean, I think it's a little bit different and a lot trickier to develop sunscreen versus bracelets.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that the insight that was really interesting was, when you're at the beach or you're at the pool, you're having fun, and so why are these brands so boring? And that was really the key insight. And, for the first 2 years, they kind of workshopped their ideas. This is kind of 2017, 2018, 2019. And they were really fleshing out the brand concept and the vision and the overall aesthetic direction. But they didn't launch anything and they didn't bring anything to market. And so I don't know how serious it was at the time. They probably had other things going on. So maybe this is something they were coming back to every couple of weeks. But they looking back now, they call this their creative incubation period. They would work on something, let it sit for a while, come back, make adjustments, and really just make sure they had the right tone, the right piece there. And where they centered in on where they wanted the brand to be was this leisure enhancing sunscreen. And so all of the imagery, all of the language was really about leisure and nostalgia. And going back to an era that you know, they maybe hadn't really experienced themselves, what people kind of talk about in this beach culture. And so they were going through this process, and despite their best efforts, they couldn't quite get comfortable enough putting all the pieces together to launch. But in 2019, late 2019, they found the missing piece, and that was their third co-founder, Marty Bell, who is the creator of a retro-styled internet radio station called Full Suite FM through a Slack founder group. And I don't know, did you know about Full Suite before we did this episode?
I did not, but I love how Marty describes what it is. I mean, I feel like we've just got to share this because it's pretty amazing. He basically says that it started as this side project to channel this goal of bottling the feeling of being on a permanent vacation. And his insight was that people crave leisure as a lifestyle, not just a holiday. And so he kind of developed Pool Suite FM into this, retro styled web app, like a, just vacation style, hippie 1980s Miami Vice style beach vibes, streaming, and it's just it's funky. I mean, it's pretty cool, but it's definitely very unique.
Yeah, I kind of went down the rabbit hole and I was like, okay, this is cute. And then I ended up like listening to it, watching it for like an hour as I'm like doing research. And it's just a cool thing. So, if you want to pause the podcast and go check out fullsuite.fm, it's interesting. I think when I was on, there were videos of people in swimsuits putting honey on their body and then rolling around the pit of money, like as like a game show thing. And so that's just the vibe that's there. And originally there was no business model for Poolside. It was just, that's what it was. It was completely free. It was just kind of there, but it really developed this really dedicated cult following, where it was drawing millions of sessions a year on the web player, especially during COVID. And it got picked up and was shown in magazines like Vice and GQ and Vanity Fair. and it really cemented its cultural cachet more than just its overall raw scale. So even though it wasn't a huge amount of people, it was punching well above its weight. And if you even today, if you look on Twitter or Instagram, their community is highly engaged, and they're always sharing honorary roles, playlists, band drops, and it's become a bit of a cultural institution. And the thing that was striking to me is that when you look at Pull Suite, it feels exactly like vacation, and vacation feels exactly like Pull Suite. And it's kind of hard to know by looking at them which one came first if you didn't know the history. And Lack and Dakota thought the exact same way. And so they found Pull Suite. They got connected with Marty. And since it was already embodying this 1980s leisure world vibe that they were building toward, they said, hey, we've got to bring this guy on as a co-founder, and like let's really do this brand right. And so Marty joined as a co-founder, really responsible for the creative platform, the cultural momentum. And within weeks, they really started to crystallize and start aligning on the brand strategy. And Marty helped them think about how to be nostalgia rich and to really hone their pitch deck as they went into fundraising.
Yeah, I mean, I think Marty was kind of like the missing piece when it came to the brand strategy and that feel because I mean, I feel like so much of vacation and what vacation has become kind of gets its roots from Pool Suite. So, I mean, I can only imagine what that kind of conversation and pitch went like with, Locke and just them getting Marty to come on board. But I mean, I don't know if vacation, really would be what it is today without Pool Suite. It might have just been another sunscreen brand, right? But it really kind of encompassed now this ready-made world of like escapism and nostalgia, and they could really now market through culture instead of just ads, really. And they tapped into Pool Suite's kind of cult status that they developed, right? And so by the time vacation launched in 2021, Pool Suite was already this online culture institution, really, with a reputation for leisure aesthetics. And I think it's just kind of pretty cool. But one thing that stood out is they bring Marty on in 2019, but they don't launch until 2021. And so, what did they do during those 2 years, right?
Yeah, well, they needed to get funding, right, to build the product. And so when Marty joined, it really kind of crystallized their direction. And so they put together a very interesting 42-page novella pitch deck. And it was styled like a 1980s Xerox corporate doc with bold visuals and tongue-in-cheek calls to action. And it really attracted their early investors, including Roth Martin, who's the Rothy's co-founder, and others. And they brought on people like Kat Cole and Peter Rahel, and just people were drawn by this world vision of this 1980s nostalgia. And by early 2020, they secured enough angel investment to start working on it full time. And so Locke and Dakota said, "All right, we're actually gonna do this. This isn't a side hustle anymore." And they focused on developing what they eventually became their clean classic formulations. And they worked with a well-known dermatologist by the name of Dr. Elizabeth Hale, who helped them develop what they later called the world's best smelling sunscreen. And I think it was really interesting because it wasn't just about the protection and the qualities of it, but smell was going to be such a huge part of the nostalgia and the vibe they were going for. And so, in addition to working with a well-respected dermatologist, they worked with a luxury fragrance designer, Carlos Huber, Rodrigo Flores Rue, and they really wanted to nail the scent and the packaging concepts and the overall sensorial experience. And so then they did all this. They were able to launch their first product, the Classic Lotion SPF 30, in the spring of 2021, and they did it exclusively on Pool Suite. And the tagline was the official sunscreen of leisure, which I thought was just brilliant.
Yeah, and I mean, it's pretty amazing because they launched their product in 2021 on Pool Suite FM, and it kind of launches with this unique ad that if you watch the ad, we'll include it in the show notes. It's kind of this like very grainy 1980s vibe, and I think it stands out because of that. And as you watched it, or as I kind of watched it, I wasn't even sure like, is this real? Is it actually like filmed? Like, was this made with like AI or something? It's just like kind of
Did it
crazy to
show?
watch.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's really I recommend just checking it out. It's just very unique. Um, But I think what was the most interesting part is if you think about Vacation's customer base and fan base, most of these people are like Gen Z who are obviously not living in the 80s, but they're kind of buying into this fantasy of retro leisure. And it turns out people really, really like that because within 48 hours, they had 10,000 signups. They went viral on Twitter and LinkedIn. Chris Sacca was one of the participants. And this ad generated, over $50,000 in sales with no paid ads in just a few days. And so, I mean, I think it just kind of showcases how if you're going to launch a brand in any market, it's best to do it with a community. And Vacation, really tapped into Pool Suites community and leaned into that brand and that aesthetic. And so obviously this is a great start, but it's then this challenging point to go from a gimmick where people are not really quite sure about it to an actual business. And I think that's what's interesting about Vacation is they went kind of from this joke to mainstream really in just under 2 years, which is, I mean, amazing to see and look at and dive into as we're about to do.
Yeah, and Pull Suite was front and central to this strategy. And I think one of the things I thought that they did very well was they involved that community in the early launch. And so one of my favorite kind of Easter egg things that they did was they gave away titles at the company to the first handful of people who signed up. And so these were titles like um, shrimp cocktail designer or jacuzzi temperature analyst or backgammon experts or things like that, which were kind of fun. And so people would buy the sunscreen. They'd be, hey, guess what? You're the official shrimp cocktail designer. And so they, people were putting that on their LinkedIn, and it's just driving all of this interesting stuff that's going through there. But in the spring of 21, they have their classic lotion, and it's just the inaugural product. It's an easy use lotion. It's all about the nostalgic scent, and it really serves as the foundational formula for not only the product portfolio they're going to build out, but the brand identity and the sensory experience they want to have. Fast forward to summer of 22, they launched a classic whip SPF 30, and later on did an SPF 50. And this was pretty cool. I actually had one of these. It was a whipped cream style mousse sunscreen. So like you think of the old like Barbasol shaving cream, you tilt it over and you make the star foam thing, and I remember putting this on my kids and like, what are you doing, Dad? This is so weird. But obviously, it's a highly Instagrammable, highly tactile, immediately viral product, and they leaned in and started to mail 1,500 products per week to different event organizers and influencers to really supercharge the conversation and the brand here. And they did a great job with IRL activations, whether it be summer cookouts, hotel partnerships. They started producing a bunch of merch, so hats, towels, apparel, all those sorts of things, which was reinforcing this leisure lifestyle, which they wanted to be the champions of. And in 24, they launched a whole slew of new products like Instant Vacation SPF 30, Vacation Eau de Toilette, a fragrance, Shimmer Oil, a super stick, a studio tone, Shake Shake Mineral Milk. And so there's all these different things that they were doing to kind of explode as they were, getting people to buy into these different gimmicks and quirks and really just start to fall in love with the brand even more.
I mean, it's kind of crazy how much they did in 2024 because from a product perspective, they launched so much, but then they also doubled down on this nostalgia element by taking advantage of a competitor's decision to discontinue a well-loved product. What was the story behind that?
Yeah, so the brand is Orange Galet, and it was originally started in the 1920s. So it's a 100-year-old brand, and it was started in Paris, kind of started by Coco Chanel's sun-kissed aesthetic, and it was one of the earliest tanning formulas. You've probably seen this before. It was celebrated for its very silky orange gel texture and evocative fragrance. It was similar to Bain de Soleil or the sun bath, here in the U.S. And it was really at its peak cultural relevance in the 70s and 80s. So again, that same period they're trying to harken back to. And people wanted to have a certain vibe. And so, it was beloved by style icons like Tom Ford or Michael Kors, And there was just really memorable ads that kind of built in the psyche here. And people loved it because it was unique and iconic and very different than what other brands were doing. It had this really unique texture and finish. It was like a balm to oil formula that really left your skin glistening. It was moisturized, and you felt very luxurious putting it on, despite having almost no SPF. It was like SPF 4 or something like that. But the big thing was like the fragrance, and it was this blend of citrus, clove, and sandalwood, and it was if you smell it even now, it's deeply nostalgic and something that's there. And then the last thing is they had this like metal tube, so it was like different than what you would see with other sunscreens or tanning lotions, and so it's just very, very different.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so interesting because you have this 100-year-old brand that is discontinued despite there being ongoing demand, and then you have this up and coming brand that's really based on this nostalgia element that is, really perfectly lined up to take care of it. And so they took a really unique strategy to bring it back, right? So they bought the trademark, not the formulation, but in order to really deliver this nostalgia, they needed to modernize it and really kind of mimic the elements that loyalists will be looking for. And so they started off by actually purchasing expired or nearly expired tubes on eBay for lab reference to understand the scent, color, and texture. And this helped them reverse engineer kind of the original formula. They created a advisory board. This is they basically assembled a panel of 11 lifelong fans and beauty experts who kind of really guided them on what this should be. And then they kind of retain the sensory hallmarks of the fragrance and gel texture, but replaced, outdated ingredients like mineral oil and paraffin for better, for you skin and clean alternatives. And then they upgraded the SPF to SPF 30 with broad spectrum protection that kind of aligned with this modern day safety standard. So, I mean, I'm just kind of blown away by their process to kind of bring this product back. I mean, I think they just went above and beyond here, and that's really, speaks just to how strong the vacation team is to be able to go above and beyond like this to bring this product back. I mean, they really went deep in terms of, you know, going kind of forward to go backwards in some sense. But they
Yeah.
relaunched in late 2023. There was a 15,000 person wait list by launch time. And the product sold out in 3 days when they launched. And I mean, I think it's just a testament to the cult appeal and just this incredible execution by the team. I mean, we've talked about a lot of kind of relaunches before, and I don't think we've covered a team that has gone this in depth.
No, and I think it was started in the 1920s. It was discontinued in 2019, and this almost feels like it was purpose built for this vacation team that was trying to do nostalgia. And so, they're looking at this, they're seeing this outcry, they're seeing that these tubes that were produced in 2019, they were selling for hundreds of dollars on eBay because there was still this very dedicated fan base, and they just kind of came to this conclusion that, hey, somebody should bring it back, and that should probably be us because that's our whole thing. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn here, and I think there's probably a very interesting playbook for other founders, other startups in terms of bringing back legacy brands with all of this cultural affinity. And the big thing here, I think, in terms of the masterclass that the vacation team did, was that they involved these super fans in the creative process. So they wanted to make sure that it wasn't just a mimic of what was there. They wanted to make sure it was as authentic as it possibly could be. And then they also wanted to make sure that they modernized it, they made it better, they made it safer, more sustainable, all those sorts of things. And so they decided to revive this brand and to tap into the equity, but to keep the sentimental pieces, specifically the scent and the texture, while making it much more helpful that way. And then obviously, like when they launched it, they did it with a pre-launch. They took a massive waiting list. They got people excited about it, as opposed to trying to sell this in Target or just launching one day. And so I think that there's a lot there that people can look to. And obviously, we talked about how they started with full suite. It was D2C first. Are they still only D2C today?
I mean, so much of what they do is driving virality on TikTok and Instagram, and through Pool Suite. But their first foray into retail was actually in 2022 through Ulta Beauty. And after that, a lot of doors began to open for them. So, Target, they were promoted heavily, placed on aisle ends, which of course meant, high visibility and sales bumps. They're in CVS, Costco, Nordstrom's, Bloomingdale's. And so retail credibility really amplified the brand's legitimacy and accessibility. And I mean, it's pretty incredible because right now, today, they're over 1% of US sunscreen, market. So they're about like 1.1% of the total market, which is actually enough to make them the 13th largest kind of sunscreen company in the category. And they're the number one selling sunscreen product in Target, which I thought to be pretty fascinating. So, I mean, this is just a fantastic story. It makes me wonder how much capital have they raised? What's their kind of financial milestones look like? And so we talked a bit about their kind of seed angel round in 2021. They then raised a $6 million Series A in May of 2023, led by C-List Capital, with participation from True Beauty, BFG Partners, and Sonoma Brands. And they raised a Series B in mid 2024 from Avocation that also put in an additional $10 million. And was led by True Beauty Ventures, and there's celebrity investors in this round like Emma Stone. And so at this time, revenue was approximately about $40 million in 2024, and it's expected to actually double in 25, and turn a profit for the first time this year as well. So, I mean, just incredible growth, incredible storytelling. I love the kind of nostalgia aspect of this, and I think they're going to continue to grow. I mean, there's definitely a lot of exit potential here, if you ask me.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, there's a couple of fundamentals that if they can stick to, they're going to have lots of options. And that's, of course, being profitable and continuing to grow. And with, an $80 million in projected revenue and lots of brand equity, they're really well positioned even today for a 200 to $300 million acquisition, or even more if a strategic company sees that, there's a lot of value here in bringing in a Gen Z tech customer, those sorts of things. And so I would be paying attention to companies like Estee Lauder, L'Oreal, Coty, Shiseido, who they have a good track record of acquiring high growth niche brands, and these businesses are really in a race to try to diversify and rejuvenate their portfolios, especially when it comes to Gen Z and digital first audiences. And so this is a really attractive asset to those types of buyers. And I think that you point to L'Oreal's acquisition of Youth to the People and Aesop, and this is really something that expanded their clean beauty chops and premium offerings. And I think that this could play well in those sorts of portfolios. You could also see something where there's a fast fashion or another roll up like Elf, which we talked about recently, acquired Rhode for $1 billion. They're ideal candidates there too. And so there's a lot of potential here for this brand if they just keep it going. Um, but I think they're certainly approaching that exit window, certainly in the next 18 to 24 months.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think the brand is just off to a really strong foundation right now and going to continue to grow. And I mean, let's say they are to prepare for an exit window. I mean, what are some things you'd recommend that they should do to prepare?
A lot of it is the same. So, from a growth and profitability perspective, they need to continue to grow, 50%, 100% year over year. They need to make sure that they got good, clean unit economics. Typically, you're looking at least 7 quarters of consistent profitable growth for a strategic company to look at that. So they're probably, if they're turning profitable this year, they probably have the rest of 2025 and then all of 26, and then maybe they can do something in 27. But they also need to kind of make some decisions around international reach distribution. And so can they maintain the retailer momentum that they have? They've got really good presence in their top tier accounts and, the Targets, the CVS, the Nordstroms of the world, but can they continue to grow in emerging markets and brands? Does this nostalgia aesthetic translate to Europe, to South Africa, to Asia, to China, those places? They're doing a job from a brand asset point of view. They've got really unique formulations. They've got a cult following with their brand. But I think that the big thing here is they've got to make sure that they continue to harden their supply chain. And so, I usually tell founders that, your marketing and your profitability, your finance will get you an LOI, which says, hey, we think your business could be worth this much. That's the maximum that a buyer is going to pay. Everything else gets discounted from there. And so making sure that they've got really strong quality processes, good succession planning, they've got the right contract, the right redundancies in place is really what they need to do to make sure that they don't have any discounts off of those LOIs.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think they're gonna. I have a feeling they're gonna exit in the next, I don't know, 18 months. We'll call it, and then we'll do another episode reflecting on how accurate we were. But I mean, let's say you were to acquire a vacation. Are you acquiring the revenue, the formulation, the culture engine? I mean, to me, I think this is one of the few brands that we've covered that really has kind of encompass this feeling of nostalgia and really kind of leaned into that feeling as a brand and as a company. And I just kind of reflect back on the dichotomy of traditional sunscreen and what's mostly used today still, right? I mean, you go to the beach and parents are spraying bottles of SPF 50 on their kids, and who knows what chemicals are in there. And I think now you have kind of this newer, well-being, really environmentally friendly and sustainably formulated sunscreen that is gonna really take over more of the market, right? I mean, we mentioned that this category is only like $900 million in sales per year right now, and I mean it's small, right? I mean the category itself is still small, and in my opinion, it's going to become the majority in the next decade.
Yeah, certainly with the mineral-based sunscreens, I could see that happening. It's you kind of pose an interesting question because one, I think the most interesting thing about vacation is that they sell nostalgia or a period of nostalgia to people who didn't actually live in that period. So there are very few of their customers that grew up going to pools in the 1980s, but that's the vibe everybody's going for. But like you're saying, the revenue market is relatively small when you look at skincare in general. And so, the fact that they're able to be, 1% of the market in just over a year and a half is pretty remarkable. But the revenue itself, like, yes, it needs to be profitable. So that I don't think that's the main thing that people will be buying for. What they've been able to do is they've kind of started to create a new category where it's not necessarily about sunscreen as the event of being at the pool or being at the beach, but they're starting to move it into that everyday use. And so that's something that I think is really interesting to people. Because you can imagine if I'm an acquirer and I'm looking at a couple of brands, and yeah, maybe I sell one tube at the beginning of the summer, per year. That's a tough business to have long term. But if I have somebody who's like, yeah, I just like the way it smells, and I'm going to wear it all the time, and I get to sell 3 or 4 bottles a year, like that's a much better consumer, and they're not necessarily taking market share, they're expanding market share by changing the customer behavior. And so I think that there's something really special about this brand. Its connection with Gen Z, and I could see an acquirer getting very excited about just bringing additional people into that product family, and then potentially being able to cross sell other products down the road.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said really making this an expansion of a category. And, really, I think, like we mentioned, more people are becoming aware of skin cancer and, how likely they are to get skin cancer. And I think vacation is actually becoming a kind of daily necessity or option for people that are aware of the potential of them getting skincare, and they're using it year round, not just in the summer. I think that's a major, key that you just mentioned. So, I mean, I love this story of vacation. I think we're gonna reflect on this in 18 months when they get acquired. And I'm curious for those listening, have you heard of vacation? What do you think of this story? Let us know. Aaron and I are always interested in hearing people's feedback and comments. And we really appreciate you tuning in this episode of E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Source Finance. And leave a review, share it with a friend, and thanks again for tuning in.